nonprofit webinar, Culture Can Be Costly, Why You Need Intentional Culture Creation. Just a couple of housekeeping things for anybody who does need CPE. We will be having polling questions throughout the presentation, so you can look for those. Also, if you have any questions as our speaker is speaking, if you want to put them in the Q&A, we will address them at the end of the presentation. So just a little bit, I'd like to introduce our speaker to you. Her name is Brittany Hale. Brittany graduated from Boston University School of Law and began her early career working as a securities litigation analyst at Bloomberg. Here she began to develop marketing strategies for her clients, which led her into trial work for a Fortune 500 company, where she obtained a 100% trial success rate in superior and appellate court. Brittany also has the distinction of being the youngest Black woman to hold office in her state. Brittany utilized these experiences in litigation, politics, and marketing to develop B&D Consulting Groups. B&D Consulting Groups helps companies codify, clarify, and elevate core values as an operational framework for decision-making to establish a competitive edge. Among her other accomplishments, Brittany is the vice chair of the GEM Project, a nonprofit which provides leadership and educational workshops for students in economically depressed communities. She also serves as the youngest woman ever on the Rahway Redevelopment Agency. She is a 2021 New Leaders Council Fellow, serves on the Rutgers University Dean's Cabinet, and is one of the top 20 millennials on Insider New Jersey's 2021 Top 100 Millennials list. So with that, I am really looking forward to this presentation. It's all yours, Brittany.
Thank you so much, Tara, for that introduction. And thank you for taking some time to speak with us today. So this is something that I'm super passionate about and sharing with my clients because, as I always say, culture can be costly. It doesn't have to be, but today we are going to figure out why you need intentional culture creation. So hopefully you can see my screen, and here's just an overview of what we're going to discuss. Tara gave me a beautiful introduction, and I'm just going to add a little bit more. Next, we'll move into defining culture, because very often we say the same word but have different meanings. Then we're going to talk about how culture manifests in the private sector as compared to nonprofits. And then we'll be moving into why HR is not enough. I know that may sound polarizing, but I ask that you stay with me. And then I am going to give you an example, a real life example of when culture gets costly, specifically within a nonprofit. And that's taken from a case study that I did with a former client. And then once we've addressed what it can look like and how it can be problematic, we'll move into the solution phase, and we'll talk about how you and your organization can take the first step. And then after that, if you have any questions, Tara will let me know, and then we will move forward. So I hope that you'll stay with us throughout the whole time, and let's get started, okay? So as Tara told you, my name is Brittany Hale. I am the CEO and founder of B&D Consulting Group. And I developed an organizational design consultancy after a very full career as an attorney, and also served as an HR director, okay? So my perspective on culture is informed both by internal audiences, but also that compliance piece as well. And so after my time as an attorney, as an HR director, I pivoted toward a more proactive as opposed to a reactive space and became an organizational design consultant and worked to help leaders develop those transformational skills that are going to help them engage their internal audiences as an executive coach. So what is culture? And at this time, Tara, if you could pull up the poll, I'm curious to know, has your organization discussed culture? So there should be a poll which you can choose one of the options, but very curious because we hear it all the time, right? And most often we hear the word culture used outside of the context of work. But as it pertains to work, what do we mean when we say culture? So before I tell you what it is, we'll start with what it isn't. And the first thing is culture is not ping pong tables. It's not unlimited kombucha, okay? It's not bring your dog to work day. It's not all of those things that you may see in tech startup companies, right? All of those perks that we hear about within certain organizations. That is not culture. Culture is also not a coffee cup. Okay. It's not a coffee cup. It's not a pen. It's not a lanyard. That is not what we mean when we're talking about culture. What we mean and what we're talking about when we say culture is that culture is a framework for decision making within an organization. Okay, each organization, whether you're aware of it or not, you have a culture. Okay, and that is defined as the framework for decision making. How do you make decisions? Who makes decisions? Why they get to make those decisions? All of that informs your culture. Okay, so if you're thinking, saying, I don't really know. When I think of culture, we don't have kombucha in our workspaces, right? Perhaps we have lanyards, but I wouldn't say that's consistent with my understanding. This is what we mean by culture. Okay, the framework for decision making within that organization. So if you think of your organization as a house, right, your culture is going to be that foundation, right? It's going to be the groundwork upon which everything else builds. That is going to be your culture. Now that we've defined it, again, we're all saying the same word, and hopefully we're all meaning the same thing. Now, let's explore what culture is like in the private sector as compared to the nonprofit sector. Now, just like the nonprofit sector, the private sector is now having to wrestle with this idea of culture and, more importantly, what it means to intentionally create culture within an organization. Now, within the private sector, in both my experience and what I've seen in other organizations, is that there's a focus on driving efficiency and retention. And we've seen that culture can be a means by which an organization can drive efficiency within their internal audiences and retain talent. Okay, so what you may not know is that culture can increase employee engagement. And what we've learned over time is that just with an extra 15 minutes of productivity, organizations are able to increase their revenue by 3%. Okay, just another 15 minutes, right? That's one less loop that you might take around the building as you're for, a midday walk. But 15 minutes translates to 3% increase in revenue for these private organizations. So knowing that culture drives employee engagement, this is increasingly becoming a conversation that's happening. When you have B2C or business to consumer, direct to consumer companies, they're seeing culture as an attraction tool. Okay, so I believe you just had a symposium where you found that social impact is the new PR, and that's not only happening within the nonprofit sector, but it's happening within the private space as well. And I believe that was Shakira Johnson. Thank you so much for that, that wonderful phrase. But again, when we see these B2C companies, they're saying that, wow, they're developing a relationship with consumers and developing a story about their organization, about the services they offer and the products that they offer. And so by sharing their internal culture and sharing how they make decisions within their internal audiences, this is a means by which they can attract external audiences as well. We see that within the private sector, it's becoming increasingly intentional. Okay, we're seeing that these organizations are starting to really see that, humans are still and will remain, despite this tech world that we're living in, the greatest resource. And so it's worthwhile for an organization to figure out how they may meaningfully engage their internal audiences. by building an intentional culture. And lastly, we see within the private sector that organizations are learning to connect culture to operational strategy. Now, at B&D Consulting Group, that's something that I really, really love doing, right? We're very excited to take all of those aspirational values and turn that into operational ones, right? What are you doing day to day? So many of us have that About Us page, right? And we see that, very often an organization will say, oh, we're like a family here. And, if you ask some of their employees, they may say, yeah, it's more like the Manson family, right? It's not something that we would think of. And so that's why it's so important that organizations learn this. And we see within the private sector that there's more of a push to be intentional about that. Now, within the nonprofit sector, and taking again from my experience with my clients that are nonprofits, the first thing that we have to get over, right? The first hurdle that we have, and you can let me know in the chat if you've experienced this, that, you know, we kind of assume that culture is self-explanatory because of the mission, right? We will say, well, we work for a nonprofit, right? We're seeking to engage communities that have been historically or disproportionately underserved. And that in and of itself defines our culture, right? We don't need to think about culture because we're in the business of helping. All right. And we almost have a moral superiority, right? When it comes to these discussions about culture, right? We're helping. We're not out for profit. And therefore, we don't need to do any of this. We don't really need to think about this. And quite frankly, this is the greatest area for growth within the nonprofit space. Because when you think about culture as a framework for decision making, what organization does not want to examine how they're making decisions, and better yet, figure out how to make better decisions so that they can better help the communities that they're serving, right? Especially when we see that service leadership is an integral part of company culture. So within the nonprofit sector, this is something that we're starting to address, that we're starting to push through, but we see it's so crucial that organizations begin to think about that. And so again, we're, facing that uncertainty, right? Does culture apply to us? And again, that's when I've gotten these questions. Well, I don't know. We don't do a bring your dog to work day, or, we don't have nap rooms and all of these things that you may see within the private sector. And that's okay, right? Because that's not what culture is about. It's about building trust with your internal teams so that you're able to show up and help the communities and help the spaces in a better way, right? You're more able to leverage the talent within your organization to help those that are outside and being served by your organization. We're also seeing that there's more of a focus on funding, right? And we're seeing that more nonprofits, when it comes to funders are starting to ask about this, right? What are you doing about culture? How are you developing equitable environments internally, right? So that you can develop equitable spaces externally. This is increasingly being asked of organizations. And we're starting to see that organizations, because they've not thought about this, are really losing out on that funding. So, this has become something that nonprofits are starting to think about, and then figuring out how culture can become an attraction tool. Okay, so I've seen with nonprofits, there's something somewhat of a, let's say, pragmatic compromise, right? Because funders and grantors are so important to the health and vitality of this organization, that the organization is thinking about how best to remain authentic to their mission, but also how best to appeal to the interests of funders, right? And so very often this pragmatic compromise has you coming somewhere down the middle. But we're starting to see that by developing an authentic identity within your industry through intentional culture creation, this now becomes an attraction tool so that funders are seeking you out. Okay, funders are now coming to say, we see what you're doing here. We see how you're showing up in this space. We would like to offer these opportunities. And so these are the trends. These are the things that we're starting to see within the nonprofit space. We see that culture has been addressed almost ad nauseum within the private sector, but when we're focusing on nonprofits, I'd love for you all to share your experience and start thinking about what it looks like for you. What does culture look like for you in the nonprofit space? Because whether you believe it or not, it does apply. Now, I'm going to shake the table a little bit, okay? And at this point, we're going to have our second question come up. Tara, if you can add that poll question, that would be fantastic. And the question is, do you have an HR department? Okay, and some of you may say, of course we do. Are you crazy? I ask because I've worked with organizations that do not, and either they worked with an HR consultant. I've worked in a role as an HR consultant for nonprofits. And also, sometimes there's, exporting that issue. But when we talk about culture, very often a nonprofit will say, leadership will say, well, we have HR, right? Well, think about HR will help us figure that out. And here is where I'd like to share the secret with you. HR is not enough. Not because they're not capable, not because they're not competent, but HR is not enough because HR is trained to do what is federally and state compliant. Okay? Are we doing the legal thing? And so there's a knowledge gap when it comes to culture. There's a knowledge gap when it comes to retention and strategies to develop equitable environments. Again, it's not speaking to their competency. And I would hazard a guess that your HR departments or your HR person is already overwhelmed, okay? They've got enough on their plate. And now you're adding the added element of culture, right? And by the way, can you figure out an attractive culture that's going to make funders come knocking on our door? That's a hefty task for someone who was hired to make sure that we're in compliance with existing federal and state laws, to make sure that we are focused on building out policies and procedures that are compliant, okay? And so that is why HR simply is not enough when you're thinking about culture. You really need to bring in leadership, and you need people who understand what culture looks like and provide that initial support so that your teams, and most importantly, your leadership, can respond effectively. Okay, so I don't want you walking away from this and sending an email to HR and saying, fix this, give us culture. Okay, that's not the point of what we're going to do today, but I really wanted to make sure that we addressed this point and that we were very clear on why HR is not enough. And so here comes the situation that I wanted to share with you. So once upon a time, I was called in to conduct an independent investigation into allegations of sexual harassment and preferential treatment within a nonprofit. And of course, my legal background, right? This is having worked as an HR director. This is something that I do occasionally from time to time and had no problem doing it for this individual organization. And I found that while conducting the investigation, that employees were unusually reticent, unusually disengaged, and unusually paranoid. Okay, I had certain people that refused to even have their one-on-one with me within the building. All right. And this obviously happened before we had remote teams, before everyone was working from home. But it was an issue. And it was very strange to me. And I typically, again, we all have people within our organizations that some are a little bit more disengaged than others. That's okay. But at every level, managers, first year associates, people at every level were so disengaged, so cynical, so paranoid that I figured something wasn't right. Something else was going on here. Then we get to fly on the wall. So over time, through these investigations, through these interviews, someone had mentioned a game, I say that loosely, called Fly on the Wall. And during this game, the executive director would call in a manager. And the executive director would say to that manager, "Manager, I want you to call Manager B, and I want you to start talking about me as if I'm not here." And Manager A, they're sitting there with the executive director, and executive director says to Manager A, "Put the phone on speaker, call Manager B, and talk about me. I want to know what Manager B thinks about me, really." And so Manager A, feeling intimidated, feeling that their job is on the line, wanting to be accommodating, right, and avoid conflict with this person who is heading the whole organization, agrees to do so and has this conversation with Manager B as if the executive director wasn't there. And you can imagine Manager B is just being honest. So if they've had a good experience, then perhaps they share that. But if they've had a negative experience, and again, we've had a lot of experiences of preferential treatment, of sexual harassment, then these people were being very candid, thinking that they're speaking to their peer and only speaking to their peer. Meanwhile, executive directors hearing everything. Executive director would then schedule a one-on-one with Manager B at some later time and quote verbatim what Manager B said to Manager A. Can you see where this paranoia started coming in, right? Can you see where people and why people were so disengaged? Because trust was completely eradicated within this organization due to the executive director developing a culture of intimidation and bullying. So these managers began believing that this executive director was almost like the Wizard of Oz, right? This omniscient being who saw all and heard all and was able to know everything that was going on, everything that everyone said. And in an effort to escape being targeted, you had employees, managers, everyone turning on one another, right? So when Manager B is faced with what they said about the executive director, they're turning on Manager A, right? Well, I'll call Manager A right now and I'll tell, you can listen and Manager A will have said X, Y, Z. So then we get into this space where this environment is so, and I hesitate to use the term toxic, but that's pretty much what it was, right? It was an incredibly toxic space where you had absolutely no trust within the organization. And so I was reporting to the board of directors, and this was very concerning, right? And what I expected to be perhaps a few pages, just on an isolated incident or two of what happened, turned out to be almost like a few chapters, right, of what was going on, as well as the opportunities and what management could do. And so then the board of directors said, We want to give this person an opportunity to change things and turn it around. So we would like for you to provide some executive coaching. And at that time, I'd made my own recommendations. And Tara, feel free to add that third poll question because I'm curious to know what you would have done if you were responsible for the executive director. What would you do about the executive director if you were on the board of directors? Nevertheless, I said, okay, we'll do some executive coaching. We'll see what we can do. And when I work with people as an executive coach, I'm very curious to know, again, their internal culture system, right? How do they make decisions? And so the executive director says to me, when he said, what I'm hearing is that, there's some pretty gnarly things going on. What do you think about that? And the executive director says, well, I don't fire anyone. I just make them want to quit. Now, when we talk about culture, when we talk about, right, a framework for decision making, we now have a space where employees are targeted, intimidated, harassed, bullied to the point where they believe that they're forced to leave, right? Because they are no longer welcome based on this individual's belief about them. Very interesting. And I'm going to pause a moment. Tara, do we have the results of that third question? I'm curious to know what people are thinking.
We do. About 40% said fire them.
Okay.
33% said demote them. And actually 27% said give them another chance.
Okay, great. And so the 27%, right? That's what happened here, right? We had some executive coaching, and then we were able to move forward. And so here's what happened: the fallout. So, in an effort to reconcile, well, let's go back for as long as this person's been in charge and figure out what's happening. We saw that turnover increased 40% within the past 3 years of leadership. Now, again, some of us in the nonprofit space, depending on the roles, right? Perhaps there are some admin roles and other opportunities where we see that people may come and go for various reasons, and that's okay. We typically do not see such high turnover when it comes to management, right? And that's a huge issue. So whenever I see turnover this high, right, on average, turnover is about 25 to 28%. But when you see 40% and you see it in management roles where there's assumed to be a certain amount of security and, opportunity for growth, that's when, I start getting a bit concerned. And we see that the cost of that turnover, of constantly onboarding, offboarding, adding benefits, taking benefits away, all of this, we saw that in 3 years, they're spending about $150,000. Okay? When we had people offboarding, okay, and at the end of their employee life cycle and their exit interviews, talking about their next steps, right? And being very candid about what they were looking at. So in concluding my investigation, I went and just looked at some verdicts and recent verdicts and settlements for, I can't say similar behavior because it was just so unusual, but in other organizations where, there were claims of employee discrimination, we saw that the projection was about $250,000. Okay, so about $250,000 they were looking at in settlements, absent some sort of curative action. And lastly, a loss on a very important funding opportunity that they normally gotten year after year. And ironically, the individual that was responsible for these grants received feedback that the organization was aware, right, of the culture within the organization, and just felt it was too risky. Okay, so this is $100,000 grant that they lost out on because of the actions of this individual. Now, I'm curious to know if anyone in the chat, after seeing this, perhaps you voted one way on the poll. Did anyone have a change of heart? Anyone say, you know what, maybe they didn't deserve a second chance. Maybe I should have outed them. Curious to know that. But this is what we talk about when I say culture can be costly, right? When you develop a space where you allow those in charge to develop a framework for decision making that is very much based on either their internal value system or the lack thereof, in such a way that you are compromising the health and integrity of the organization as a whole. Okay, huge issue, something we definitely don't want to happen. And so that begs the question, right? I've presented you with a very big problem. Hopefully, none of you watching this are enduring anything like this. But what do, right? How do you go from HR that's focused on compliance to a commitment to intentional culture creation? Well, I see it as a 3-part formula of assess, align, design. And the first thing is assessing where you are. Okay. And that's through a cultural assessment, an equity audit, right? If we think about, and for those of you who may use equity and equality interchangeably, while equality is treating everyone the same, equity is understanding that there are differences that make a difference and providing those resources that allow for your internal audiences to show up and perform to the best of their ability, right? So how do you develop an equitable environment where everyone gets what they need to succeed and pour as much value as they can into the organization? So an equity audit, right? Evaluating aspects of your organization that are going to, perhaps there's some room for growth. A cultural assessment, right? What's our culture like? What do our internal audiences think our culture is like? What do our employees think? Okay, what does leadership think? And you can add in the chat there. I'm very curious to know if you've ever experienced that, right? Where you had managers or you had directors who have a vastly different understanding of the organization than the people on the ground. Okay, and that's happened. I've seen it. It happens, right? But then very often there's that moment where we need to come back together. Aligning, right? What does that mean? Making sure everyone's on the same page. Okay, so first starting with leadership and asking, what do you want to achieve? How do you want employees to show up? How are you showing up, right? Are your behaviors and your messaging in alignment? Is there a gap between what you're saying and how you're actually operating? And what is that gap costing you? Okay, is it costing you time, resources, talent, funding opportunities? Okay, these are all very important considerations. And very often, I talk about service leadership, but that's grounded in values-led leadership, right? Service is a value. And so if we focus on values-led leadership, and again, this is when you think about values-led leadership, that's way more inclusive, right? Because there's no one group that has a monopoly on a value, right? But when we think about that, how do we get leaders? How do we provide leaders with the transformational skills to leverage the people they're in charge of? Okay, how do you communicate with the people that you're in charge of? Okay, if integrity and honesty and hard work are some of the values that are supposed to be rifled throughout your organization, can you honestly say that that's something that you're bringing to your work every day? And there's no judgment if it's not, but we see that as an opportunity. Okay, so that next alignment piece is very important. And then once we're clear on that vision, once we're clear on the mission, right? Then we need to design a roadmap, right? How do we get there? How do we implement all of these things that we've discovered, right? Whether it's okay, we have a gap between our behaviors and messaging. We have a gap between our aspirational values and our operational strategy. We need to shift our strategic planning. How do we get there? That's that design piece. Okay, and that is something that is going to be incredibly crucial as you move forward. And I'm just going to pause for a moment because Tara, I'd love to share our last question because I'm curious to know, and we have such a short time together, but I'm curious to know if your perspective on culture has shifted at all. And there should be a poll up. And Tara, if you'd be so kind as to share the results, that'd be fantastic. Okay, so
They're still answering, I think. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So again, this is our fourth and final question. Whether in our time together, your perspective on culture has shifted at all. I'd be very curious to know.
So right now, about 21% yes, 26% said no, and about 50% are still processing.
Okay, that's good, right? And so again, this is an opportunity for you to reflect and think about it. And let's go to the benefits, right? So why is this important? First, if you can align your intentions with the impact, this helps you become more effective in your space. Okay, this is going to be something that is going to help you show up for the communities that you serve better. Next, when you approach culture creation with intention, we see that you're going to support the development of psychologically safe and inclusive teams. And at a time where employee well-being is so important, so crucial, this is important, right? You're increasingly going to have to ask, how can we create spaces that are more inclusive? Is there an opportunity for us to create spaces that are more psychologically safe? And in so doing, you're able to foster trust with your employees, with your internal audiences, right? If you can say to your teams, hey, we're looking at developing our culture, right? We've acknowledged that we've had some unintentional pivots. And so we're going to take some time to reflect and then come back. And then you're able to actually come back and change that. That is so very important and helps you foster trust, right? And of course, we all know what it feels like when we love the place that we work at, right? When we love what we do, we love that we can make a difference to someone else. And so when you're fostering trust, you're allowing a space where your employees can come in and show up in a way that they have not previously. Again, we spoke about that part where you're able to attract funders, right? They're now interested in organizations that are redefining their relationships, right? That are using that vulnerability as a strength to say, hey, we're making some massive changes. We're doing a pivot. This is what we're working on. Okay, you're bringing your funder in on that journey with you. And when you're able to show and prove, all the more reason to strengthen that relationship with them and to have them more invested in the success of the organization. And then lastly, of course, you're attracting the best talent, okay? Because culture is increasingly becoming an issue that talent is considering. Now, I understand we may think that everyone under 40 is a millennial, but we are dealing with a workforce that has the most generations in it, okay? And both millennials and Gen Z. And so in less than 3 years, millennials are going to be 75% of the global workforce. And Gen Z are going to be about 30% of the workforce in the United States, okay? And so when we think about that, we see that 86% would consider taking a pay cut to work in an organization where the mission and the values align with their own. Okay? As you saw in the symposium, social impact is the new PR. And when you have people who are interested in getting into the nonprofit space, right, who want to make a difference, they want to be in an environment where making a difference is important. Making a difference is emphasized and highlighted. And if they can see that leadership takes that very seriously and also wants to make a difference internally with their employees, that is something they're looking for. And over 70% of millennials consider company culture when taking a job. Okay, so when you have these people who are super engaged and who are super focused on making a difference, it's worthwhile to ask how we get there. Okay, so at this time, my hope is that we have some questions. I'd love to hear what you're thinking of.
So I'm in the Q&A right now. As of now, there are no questions, but I would encourage people to ask questions if they have them now.
Absolutely. And I don't think we went over the results of questions 1 and 2. Do you still have those available, Tara?
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
So poll 1 was, has your organization discussed culture?
Mm-hmm.
And that was 81% yes.
Oh, that's great.
Only 6% no. And 13% were they started to.
Okay.
So I thought that was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Then the other second one was, do you have an HR department? And overwhelmingly 53% said yes,
Mm-hmm.
but still a high amount, 40% said no. And then there were 7% that said they outsource the HR services. So
Okay.
quite a few that don't really have an HR department at this time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, again, that happens, right? Especially if you're an organization that's growing very quickly, you want to make sure that you have that support. But when you're wholly reliant on funding, it's an interesting space. Okay, so I'm not sure if we have any questions, but I also want to make sure that we just emphasize it takes a lot of courage to be curious. Okay, and when I say that, when I work with organizations, where we're either doing a cultural assessment or an equity audit, they're a little sometimes, ignorance is bliss, right? We think ignorance is bliss. We don't necessarily want to know the answers to those questions. However, we need to be able to diagnose issues before we're able to treat them. And so I always encourage you to have the courage to be curious, to think more intentionally about how you approach work, most importantly, how you're making decisions within your organizations. And then again, as always, we welcome you to learn more with us. So you can do that by visiting our site, anywhere, LinkedIn, we're always available. At this time, let me see if
So we do have one question in here, Brittany.
Sure.
This is from Kristen, and she says, we work hard on trying to foster a positive and productive culture with our staff. However, there are some individuals who seem determined to be negative. How do we work with that?
Kristen, that's a great question because, and I often want to highlight when we're thinking about culture, it's not an employee wish list, right? It's not just, okay, we're going to let employees decide how we show up. And then, of course, we know there are some people who are just never going to be satisfied, right? We can do everything they ask and they say, well, and another thing. So Kristen, when you're talking about working hard to foster that positive and productive culture, and there are individuals who seem to be determined to be negative, I'd be curious to know how they're being negative. Is it that, they're just showing up grumpy? Is it that they are, saying, oh, okay, but we haven't fixed this. And, we still have these types of things. And the way that I tend to approach people like that is to invite them to solution, to finding a solution, right? So, Tara, I know that's not you, but if it were, right, to say, well, Tara, we really value your feedback. I'd love to know, how would you approach the situation? And sometimes, you're able to see a different perspective, and maybe they do have a good idea about something that you can incorporate and fold in. And other times, you know, they may just continue to be surly, right? But you can always say, and here's that part where you're building out trust, Kristen, is to say, look, we've asked you, we've brought you in on the ground with us as we're trying to foster a positive culture, as we're trying to build out productivity. We're open to employee feedback. We haven't heard anything from you, right? Or what you're proposing, right? A 2-hour workday is just not going to be feasible for what we're trying to accomplish. So making sure that always making sure that solutioning is the goal, and then moving from there.
So I think that's great, to make really the problem people part of the solution sometimes can be really, really helpful.
Yes.
Jeffrey also has a question. He is, what are the biggest barriers you see to organizations doing an audit for this? For staff or leaders who may need to pitch this, are there any good ways to start that conversation?
Right. And thank you, Jeff, for that question. It's a good one. So when you're thinking about an audit, sometimes if there's sort of a big gaffe, right? A big oops that happened, such as a fly on the wall, or, some sort of big event where you need to take curative action, we can see that as an opportunity, right? And that would be the easiest way to say, hey, listen, this happened, but that's not enough. We're actually going to need to move toward doing something else, right? Censuring them, demoting them, whatever it is. Even if you're letting someone go, you still have a whole group that's sitting there that you need to communicate with. And part of leadership is being in constant communication with your teams. And it doesn't mean that you're telling them everything, but being very strategic about how you're communicating with them, right? Because we all know, you can add to the chat, I've been in that situation where something big happens, leadership says nothing, and we all fill it in with our own personal stories, right? Well, I think this happened, and I think that happened. So when you have a large event that happens, that's usually the best way to bring it up as a form of curative action. Absent some sort of large event, absent an opportunity to say, look, this is a big issue, then I would also go to feedback, right? Is there a grant that you didn't get because you didn't include a DEI methodology? Are there opportunities that you're missing out on because you don't have a perspective on it, right? That's another avenue for you to say, listen, we're missing out on opportunities to support our own organization. Here's how I think we can do this. And if that's, if again, you haven't missed out on an opportunity, you're just curious to know like what you don't know, then again, for leaders, why would you miss out on the opportunity to further engage your teams? Okay. And so when you're thinking about, the biggest barrier is mindset. All right. It's always mindset. Either we don't want to know, or, I think we'll have it handled, or there's all of these excuses, which ultimately, when we pare it down, comes down to fear, right? I'm afraid of knowing this because I don't know what I'll do if I do know it, right? And then once I know it, now I have to do something about it. I don't want to do that, right? And and talking to your teams, right? Talk to HR, whether it's one HR department, an HR department of one, whether it's your teams. If your managers are feeling overwhelmed, that's great feedback to take. And it's not enough to say, it's the time of the year, or they always complain, right? What if it's true? That's the question, right? Oh, Terry, you look like you were going to say something.
I think we have time for one more question. So I think that was answered well, because I agree with you. I think mindset is the biggest barrier, no doubt. Overcoming that is always your big challenge. Denise asks, management initially was seeking a cultural assessment a few years ago. After the research was completed and provided, there was no action. Staff still feels that there is preferential treatment, lack of communication, and a lack of trust. How can we get back on track for the assessment?
That's a really interesting question. And that's where two things happen. Either most organizations will get the assessment, say, thank you so much, and you never hear from them again, which is what's happening here. Or they'll say, okay, we'll do a training and we're done. And trainings and assessments are not silver bullets, right? It's opening the door, right? It's the diagnosis piece. We still need to get to the point of implementation. And so I think you said it was about 2 years ago where you had that assessment. I'd be curious to know if the feedback is still relevant. And if it is, again, bringing it back, right? We're halfway in the year. We're at the end of, Q2. What are we doing for the next part of the year? We have this information. What are we going to do with it? We've taken no step to implement it. I would be curious to know how it's been affecting those teams in the 2 years since it's been done. Because a lot has happened within the space, okay? We see that funding has sort of fluctuated, right? The availability of funding has fluctuated. We've had world events and current events and all sorts of things that have shaken up and informed how we're doing our work. Okay, so something has happened. And again, if you feel comfortable following up, I'd love to know a little bit more about that. But when you have that information, for the organization to do nothing with it, I'd be curious to know what that opportunity cost has been within the past 2 years. And that may be a great way to start the conversation, to say, look, what could we have achieved had we acted on the information when we were presented with it? What could we have done? Where could we be if we decided to make those changes? Have you lost people in the 2 years since the assessment's been done? Okay, have you lost people because of reasons identified within the assessment? That would be something that, again, I would want to know. So I hope that answers your question.
And those are all interesting conversation points, because it's true. I mean, they obviously paid for an assessment, and then must have, if they're still feeling that there's preferential treatment, lack of communication, and lack of trust, it seems as if those were things that were probably addressed somewhat in the assessment. So I would think it's a loss of opportunity, if nothing else, to change what's going on in your workplace.
Absolutely. And when you have preferential treatment, accusations of preferential treatment, and lack of communication, it all boils down to trust, right? Because then the question, well, how do I build trust back? That's the natural question that comes after that. Preferential treatment says, I don't trust that you have the same intentions or similar intentions for everyone on this team. I don't trust that my work is being valued or appreciated or engaged in the same way as someone else. So how do we build back that trust? Lack of communication, right? We all say communication is key, but it's also comprehension, right? So if you're not even communicating to understand and creating a space where employees can understand perhaps different ways that organizations are moving, there's a lot to be lost there. So I did want to follow up on that.
I thought those were all really, really good questions, and great answers. So I think it's a really good starting point for anybody who has not really been embracing, embracing it, the culture in their organization.
Absolutely. And I did want to highlight Geraldine's comment. She mentioned that they're a small nonprofit organization. Their HR falls under general office admin. For a small nonprofit like Geraldine's, it's even more important, right? It's very easy to begin to discuss and implement culture when you're a very small organization. As you scale, right, it's harder to manage a team of 10,000 than it is to manage a team of 10. But when you're smaller, that's where you want to develop the good habits, right? That's where you want to make sure that everyone's clear on their expectations that they have when they come into this organization. Because we don't shrug off our personality when we come into work, right? We all have decades of experiences that inform how we show up in the workplace. We all have decades of experiences that have informed what we believe we value, right? What our own internal culture is. And so that's not something we peel back when we show up in the workplace. It's something that's happening there. And that's really where we get into trouble, because our organizations very often don't have a culture that is strong enough to compete with our own internal culture. And when you add in a remote workforce, I'm in my home, right? I'm battling with your home culture and the organization. So that's why your organization needs to be very, very strong so that your organizational culture can withstand remote work models, pandemics, all sorts of interesting things that are coming up. And Sally, thank you for that point, that 50% are seriously considering what culture is and really taking their time to embrace the right strategies. I think that's exactly what it's about. For 50% of you to already be discussing it, I think that's a good point. Geraldine says, agree. It's easier to manage and engage with each other in a compact organization. Absolutely. And Geraldine, I would imagine, as I'm sure everyone there is doing good work, and as there's more opportunity to do that work on a larger scale, if that is the intention, again, sometimes that camaraderie gets a little bit lost, right? And what we take for granted in smaller organizations, as you scale, can be lost, and that's even more reason why having culture or thinking intentionally about culture is very important. And I also want to say, Irene was very clear that she would have fired that executive director.
So we are just about winding down now. We're right about at 2:58.
Okay.
Want to thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Brittany, that was a great presentation. Certainly brought a lot to light that I was not aware of. So very happy with that.
Absolutely. Well, if you've learned something today, even if it's, don't play fly on the wall, then I've done my job. But I do want to thank you, Tara and Sally and everyone for the opportunity to speak with you. I hope this won't be the last time that we speak, but thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone that came. Much appreciated. It was a very good presentation.